Welcome to Paul 589A, Arming the States, part of the International Security Studies Master's degree at the University of Arizona. My name is Nicholas Thorne. I'm going to be the instructor for this class. And before we dive into the material right away, I'm just going to introduce myself and then go over some housekeeping measures. Who am I? It's a deep philosophical question. But for the purposes of this particular course, again, my name is Nicholas Thorne. I received my bachelor's degree at the University of Tulsa and then received my MA and PhD at the University of Arizona. From the University of Arizona, I decided to actually go into the field. Worked at Raytheon Missile Systems for about 4 years as a global trade analyst in their Office of General Counsel. Moved on to the Tucson Police Department for about 2 years doing research and analysis. Kind of, if you ever go to their website, you take a look at the dashboards for all of their statistics. Essentially, myself and a few others were responsible for that. Then the Tucson Police Department got a little bit boring, and I decided to go back into defense. And I joined a consulting company called Defense Trade Solutions based out of Washington, D.C. And I've been there ever since for about 2 years, specializing in arms transfer issues and technology security and foreign disclosure, as well as anti tamper issues, which may sound somewhat familiar because I'm guessing that most of you are either in the industry or in the military or adjacent to one of those. So let's go ahead and get a few administrative housekeeping issues out of the way before we begin. So there's going to be three main assignments that you're really going to have to worry about within this course. One of them is going to be the discussion posts, which are going to be opening every Monday, and then they close Sunday, but there's three tasks within each discussion post that I want you guys to keep in mind. Okay, when you do a discussion post, you are going to first answer the question that I posted within the discussion forum. Then you're going to post a question of your own, and then you're going to answer one of your peers' posted questions. So each week, you should have three different posts. One answering my main question that's started that particular discussion post for the week. Then you're going to post your own question, and then you're going to answer one of your peers' posted questions. So again, there should be three posts each week that you do. On top of the discussion posts, I also have synthesis papers, which are going to be due at the end of week 3 and week 6. I usually give out the synthesis paper questions usually at the beginning of week 2, if not by the end of week 2, just to kind of give you guys about a week or more to get everything together with the synthesis papers. Not that they're necessarily that difficult, it's just I know that most of us also have jobs on the side, so I want to try to give you as much time as possible to get those prepped and get those done. And then lastly, there is the final paper, which is going to be due at the end of the course. I will give you guys those questions prior to week 8. So you will have time to prep, and then I believe I would have to check the syllabus. It's been a few weeks since I've touched that. I will give you a number of questions that you can choose from, but it's going to be written as a brief on whether or not a state should be allowed to export arms. Okay? So let's get into some of the meat of the course. If you take anything from this course, I hope that you take from it an enhanced appreciation of the complexity of arms production and trade. Most of the time, we perceive arms trade and arms production as kind of this economic transactional issue. This is kind of a historical, right? If we take a look at arms transfers from the U.S. To Israel recently, if we perceive those as just one-off events, we don't really understand how the arms production and trade system has evolved over time or where it's likely to go in the future. I want you to be able to walk away from this class with a more nuanced understanding and appreciation for the complexity of arms production and trade. It's both the cause and effect of international actions. But the interesting thing about arms production and what has made it more difficult to study than other aspects of let's say, hard power aspects within international relations is because arms production and trade really is at the intersection of three different academic disciplines. One of those is going to be political science. They're going to be concerned about this kind of nebulous abstract issue of state power. Another one is going to be military science. They're going to be really concerned about this aspect of hard power. And economics, because, well, we usually trade arms for money, and we usually produce arms because we know that we're going to make money from them. Because it's at the intersection of these three different academic disciplines, it becomes incredibly complex when I take a look at just one instance of arms trading. Political science isn't going to perfectly explain why the US transferred arms to Israel. Neither is the military science side either, and neither is the economic side. But if you exit this course learning to take aspects of all three of those academic disciplines to try to understand why states produce and transfer arms, I'm going to consider that a win. And lastly, and what you're really going to hit on this week, is how difficult it is to separate the state from arms production and trade. There is no such thing as a state without the arms trade and arms production. There's no such thing as arms production without the state. So let's go ahead and dive in really quick. Before I really dive into this week's readings and lectures, I always like to explain why should you care. I think that a lot of professors tend to begin their courses and they never explain to you like why the topic actually matters or why you should even pay attention. Why should you even listen to my lectures? And I want to spend just a few slides on that to really get you bought into it and get you interested and excited about what you're going to learn over the next 8 weeks. So why should you care, or why do I think that you should care? What you can see here on the bottom of this particular slide on the left and on the right is going to be trend indicator values on the left, which basically looks at the generalized amount of money in arms that's actually being transferred out each and every year, or in this case, every 5-year period. And then on the right shows the share of arms transfers around the globe in the 2019 period. Now, one thing I want you to take away from the left is that that's talking about billions of dollars in arms transferred every year. This is an incredibly nebulous, complex, and valuable business and international phenomena. You should care about it because this isn't like pens and paper and things like that being transferred out. These are $1 billion worth of arms that explode, that shoot, that defend, that can go on the offensive, and so on and so on and so on. This isn't an innocuous piece of equipment. This isn't an innocuous commodity. These are weapons of war. You should care about where they're going and where they tend to go over time. And to the right, I'm going to assume that most of us are from the U.S., and if you aren't, you're still taking courses within the U.S., and you're in an international security studies program, so you probably somewhat care about these issues. But if you're from the U.S., I want you to take a look at the pie on the right. That's going to be the percentage share of arms transfers in the 2019 period. 36% of all arms transfers were from the U.S. in that period alone. That's an incredible amount. If we're transferring that much, we should probably understand why we transfer arms and why we produce arms. A neat way to kind of understand exactly why you should care is let's go ahead and take the intersection of the three academic disciplines, military science, political science, and economics, and have each one of those kind of explain or inform why you should care about these issues. Let's start with economics. Why should you care? We should care because it's an incredibly big business worth an incredible amount of money. Globally, $22 billion of arms were transferred in 2020 alone. And remember, that's during the COVID 2020 years. Those were relatively slow years, especially for arms sales and arms transfers. But even within that $22 billion worth of arms, $9 billion of that, almost half, was from the U.S. alone. One other reason why you should care, and this will probably hit home to most of you in this class, because you're likely working in some type of industry that is either directly involved or somewhat adjacent to arms production and trade. Arms production and trade employs a lot of people, and depending on what state you're in, it tends to employ more than others. Within the US, 2.2 million workers were estimated to be in the aerospace and defense industry, representing 1.4% of America's total workforce. That's an incredible amount. And that also has an effect, right? If the US stopped selling arms, you're talking about 2.2 million workers who are now out of a job. But more on that in the next few weeks. One thing that you should also keep in mind too, which I think is a little bit overblown by arms producers and manufacturers, is that arms production economically also tends to spur innovation and create a term of dual use spillover. What that essentially means is something that may have been developed for defense tends to spill over into the civilian market. A great example of this would be composite use in aircraft and microwaves. When we get into arms production, especially in the third world, a big defense of why countries want to increase their production in arms in these poor worlds is because of this concept of spillover. But as you'll see, the evidence for that is pretty scant. Let's go ahead and go on to political science and what it has to say about why you should care about these issues. I'm going to assume, possibly falsely, that most of you have a political science background. So some of these terms that I talk about having to do with political science issues should ring home. But if they don't worry about it. I usually try not to go too deep into theory at any one time. So why should you care on a political science aspect of arms transfers? Well, one, arms are used to symbolize alliances. No better way a state doesn't have a better way to symbolize that it cares about another state more than transferring weapons and allowing the other state to protect itself with your goods. Arms also directly enhance military capability, which symbolizes state power. Arms can also be used to coerce other states. The U.S. uses arms trade as a tool of coercion all of the time. It can be used as a carrot or a stick. Now, arguably, using arms transfers as a carrot is far more effective than using it as a stick, especially as we enter into this era in which almost every major state produces their own arms. So if you tend to piss off a country too much, they're going to decide not to buy arms from you. They're just going to switch to somebody else. So the leverage and the coercion is still there, but it's not necessarily at the same level that it was in the past. And again, arms can be used to incentivize. So let's say that I want a country to drop its nuclear program. I may do that by allowing them to buy arms from me to a point or at a discount to allow them to have enough power to not feel insecure, feel the need to produce nuclear arms. So arms are used and have been used as an incentive to incentivize a certain political path. And arms are power. Every great power has had a robust defense industry. That isn't a coincidence. States look at arms production and their ability to produce their own arms as a symbol of being a great power. That's why every great power made their own arms, made their own ships, makes their own planes. These aren't just weapons, they're symbols. I'm showing other states that I have power and I am a legitimate state on the world stage. And lastly, on the military science side, why should you care? Well, arms are how we tend to measure what's called hard power, or military capability in international relations. And arms directly enhance military capability. Arms exporters also subsidize research and development to keep an exporting state at the tip of the spear. The reason why the U.S. tends to export so much arms is also to offset the research and development costs domestically so we don't have to pay for it. We can finance the new stuff with our sales of the old stuff. And that allows us to keep on the quote-unquote tip of the spear. Arms also provide the means for a state to use force. If a state doesn't have weapons, it can't create war. It can't advance past political measures. Arms give it that ability. And on a military science side, why should you care? Well, because arms kill. Let's be real about this. And this is something that just I have a personal pet peeve about, especially working in the industry for as long as I have. Many people tend to avoid or not even face the fact that what we're producing here, these arms, what we transfer every year, again, they aren't regular commodities, but we tend to default to treating them like that. If I'm shipping out 10 bombs, to me that's a hell of a lot different than shipping out 10 different pens, right? We're producing things which kill people, which can harm. And that's why we should still really care about who's transferring, what we're transferring, and how people are learning how to transfer within the international state system. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox for just 1 second, and we're going to jump in to the first week. The history of arms production and the state. Now, what I really try to do with this course is to give you a historical foundation to understand arms production and arms trade. The two books that I assigned this week, which are going to be Bruce Porter and Keith Krause, both these books allow you to understand the foundations of where arms production and trade came from, and also get you to understand how closely linked arms production and arms trade are to the foundation of a state and vice versa. The state, as you'll find out reading Porter's book, the state created the ability to mass produce these arms, these more complex arms like cannon. And cannon required specialized troops or more highly trained troops to fire them, and they cost a lot of money, which caused a centralization of government for you to be able to collect the money and for you to be able to fund an army that can actually use these cannon. Because you can't just pull a serf off of the fields and teach them how to fire a cannon within a day. So it behooves you as a state now to have a standing army of men who are trained in using this new complex piece of military equipment. Keith Krause's book really gets into the evolution and the foundations of where arms production and trade came from. He starts out admitting that yes, arms production and trade has been around ever since man has been around. But the difference is really prior to the 1600s, most of your arms production was done at the local level. And it was done only to arm your military and not much past that. So if you were going to make swords and arrows, you would usually only make enough to supply your own military, because there was almost no point to make more than that. So trade occurred, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And production occurred, but not at the same level that it does today. And understanding how arms production and trade has evolved gives us an eye into where it could possibly evolve in the future. The first thing that I need to get you to do is to change how you think about arms trade and arms production issues. Again, I had mentioned it earlier. Most people mistakenly look at arms production and trade as this like kind of one-off transactional issue, in a historical light. I need you to not do that. I need you to take a systems level approach. So instead of thinking about the arms trade as a one-off phenomena, think of it as a product of a larger system. So for those of you that are more familiar in political science and international relations theory, Waltz talks about this in his book Man, State, and War, where he talks about the third image. The third image is at the international level. We're looking at where states interact. So we're looking at the systemic level, at the state, and all of the other states beside it at the international level. And what's the one thing that realism teaches us? All states operate in a anarchical state system, right? There's no rules that tell a state what it can and can't do. There's kind of social norms and mores which kind of dictate its behavior, right? Because you don't necessarily, if you're a state, you don't want to go way, way off. to the point where another state is going to get mad at you and try to create war, right? But there's no governing structure there that's necessarily telling a state to not do something. Okay, so if we're looking at it at the international level and we understand that anarchy exists here, we can begin to understand why states would want to produce arms and why states may want to trade arms. But looking at it at the systemic level assists us in understanding the system view so we can identify important things that change over time. We can identify the major actors, we can identify the major producers, the major buyers, and we can also look at the international state hierarchy. And what's really interesting about it is when we begin to dive in to these major producers and these major buyers, the hierarchy of arms production tends to mirror an overall hierarchy of state power. So if we look back in the past in different eras, usually the power that we identify as this overarching most powerful state at this point in time is also the main producer at that point in time as well. One really quick thing that I want to clear up before you really dive into these books is that throughout this entire course, you are going to hear tier levels of arms producers. Okay. Now, sometimes these tiers will differ. Some authors have 4 tiers, most have 3, but they essentially talk about the same types of things. So, when I talk about tiers of arms producers, that means the ability to which that particular country can produce or import arms. Okay, so if I'm talking about a tier 1 producer, what I usually mean is it's going to be a country which is going to be self-reliant and leads the system in arms production and innovation. So take a country like the US. The US would be considered a tier 1 arms producer. Then we go down a tad bit. So let's look at tier 2. When I talk to tier 2, it's going to talk about a state that's not self-reliant. It may have developed a niche specialty of production, but it's still competitive on the world stage. So if we take a country like Israel, they are not self-reliant on their own arms production. They can't make everything they need, so they do import a decent amount of arms. But they do have a niche specialty production, especially within missiles, which allows them to be competitive on the international arms transfer stage. They can still export out and make money off of their domestic production. Then we get down to tier 3 states. Tier 3 states aren't really self-reliant, and they usually specialize, if they do produce their own arms, they specialize in the reproduction of other countries' arms. So we can take a state like India. Now that's beginning to change a tad bit, but if you look at the history of Indian arms production, every time that you think that it's going to change, it just reverts back and they end up importing a whole bunch of arms because they realize they can't make their own. But beside that point, India is a state which is not self-reliant. It cannot build everything it uses. But at the same time, it does have domestic production capability. But they usually do licensed production or co-production. With the new buy of Rafales from France, they're doing a co-production on that. With the Su-30s that they use, that was actually licensed production. So the Russians actually taught them how to build it, helped them establish factories within in India, and then help them build it. But that's still a reproduction of another country's goods. They aren't doing a whole lot of domestic innovation of their own arms. Now, again, that's beginning to change a tad bit. But you get my point. And then at the very bottom, you have the buyer, which means that these countries have no ability to produce their own arms, and they're going to be fully reliant on imports. Now, you may look at the bottom level and think, well, yeah, the Congo makes a good example. But let me tell you, most countries fall into that particular level. Most countries around the globe buy arms. But if you think about it, at an international relations theory level, every state is going to default to producing arms. You want to produce arms over everything else. You do not want to have to import and rely upon another state for your own protection, right? Because that's really what this comes down to. Is I want to make my own arms because I want to protect my own state, and I don't want to be beholden to any other state on my protection. But the problem with that is most states don't have the ability to produce their own arms. They don't have the industrial base. They don't have the money to do it. Manufacturing arms is an incredibly expensive endeavor, which means that most states just flat out can't afford it. So most states actually fall into this buyer level, and only few states fall into Tier 3, Tier 2, and Tier 1. All right, let's start to get into the history of it a tad bit. So, why should you care about learning about the history of arms production and trade? Well, it's like the old saying, to know your future, you must know your past. If we can look at the beginnings of arms production and trade and look at how it's evolved over time, we can begin to understand where it may go in the future. So we're going to look at who were the major actors in the past. We're going to look at the variables which led to change. We're also going to look at what kind of effect did that change have upon the international world order or the state power hierarchy. And then lastly, we're going to think to ourselves, if this is what happened then, can we infer a pattern which continues to occur now? I'm actually really excited that you are going to read Porter's book, because Porter's book opened my eyes in the way that it's difficult to separate out the evolution of the state and the evolution of arms production and trade. It's difficult to separate those two. And between Krause's book and Porter's book, I really want you to think about it and go, well, yeah, we wouldn't have arms production and trade without a state. But then again, we wouldn't have a state if we didn't have arms production and trade at the same time. The point that I want you to get out of this week is that state formation and modern armament production occurred almost simultaneously. Now, to begin to understand the arms production and trade system, Krause lays out some easy to understand ways to look at the evolution and the foundation of arms production and trade. Krause asks, what generated the demand for production and trade? What caused it to come about? And Krause says, it basically comes from three different pursuits. One is going to be the pursuit of wealth, another is going to be the pursuit of power, and another is going to be the pursuit of victory. And these may operate at different levels at different states at different times, but the fact is that at least one has to be involved for there to be an evolution of arms production and trade. Let's go ahead and go into each one of these just a tad bit. Krause's first pursuit that he talks about within his book is going to be the pursuit of wealth. And the pursuit of wealth basically means that a state is going to pursue a strategy to get more wealth. Well, how does that affect arms production and trade? Krause asserts that arms production is actually a product of industrial processes that require adequate economic infrastructure to be in place. What does that basically mean? As a state evolves and gets more power and becomes an industrial power, which is just kind of this natural path of the evolution of a state, it's going to pursue avenues for more wealth. So if we look at arms production and trade, usually the states that produce arms are already pursuing wealth. And what Krause also says is that the focal points of the arms transfer system should also mirror the changes in major industrial centers. And this still holds true today. Why? Because if you're trying to pursue wealth and you are trying to bring up an industry to help you sell goods and produce goods, right, and help you mobilize natural resources within your state, the fact is that you're probably going to be a wealthier state because you have the ability to invest in that economic infrastructure. So it's interesting in that the states which can produce arms are usually the more powerful states, and in that it usually mirrors these larger changes in major industrial centers. So as you go through the Krauss book, you see that the major industrial centers for arms production had shifted between Italy and into the Low Countries and France. And if you look at that same period, especially when you're looking at major industrial centers, you see it change then too. So your arms production, your main powers which are being involved in arms production, shift from Italy to France, and at the same time, you see the rise of industrial power within France and it declining in Italy at the same time. Krauss also talks about the pursuit of power, which is probably going to be the most obvious pursuit that you read, right? That's where it really makes sense to the average person is going, well, yeah, if states want more power, they're going to have an army or they're going to have some means to acquire that power, which is usually directly related to their ability to produce their own arms. So Krauss says, the primary driving force behind the large-scale production of arms is the existence of the state in potentially conflictive relationships operating under the security dilemma in a self-help system. So essentially, states are beginning to produce arms because there's nobody else to protect them. The state has to protect itself because there isn't anything over the state that is going to protect it. And what's the best way for the state to protect itself? To produce its own arms and form its own army. It goes hand in hand. Think about what we usually perceive as a state. A state has to have what? Territoriality. A state has to have some amount of land to be considered a state, right? Well, then a state, if it has to have land, it also has to have the ability to keep that land. So that necessitates the creation, or at least the use of arms, because you have to have something to deter another state or another power from taking your land. What Krauss also says is that the state system provides the inputs for large-scale investment in arms production. Remember, especially when we're going into the first revolution that we're going to talk about in a few minutes, the gunpowder revolution, cannon were incredibly expensive. And even today, most of your arms are prohibitively expensive to produce. And because of that, you have to have the ability to mobilize financial resources within your state. Well, if you're trying to mobilize financial resources within your state, what tends to happen? Well, you tend to tax all those within your state. That's an easy source of money. But if you're going to tax a whole bunch of your own people within your state, you're also probably going to need a group that makes sure that those taxes are collected. So you're beginning to create and form these state bureaucracies and consolidate power centrally within a state. Krauss also says that all states would prefer to pursue production, but there's an uneven distribution of economic, social, and technological capabilities, which mean that all will not be able to produce at the same level. So they would look to acquire those arms by other means. So a state which may not have the ability to produce its own arms, it's always going to default to trying to produce its own arms, but it may understand, like, crap, I just don't have the money, I don't have the technological power, the technological know-how. What's the second best thing? Well, I have to go find somebody to buy arms from. Or I could look for people in different countries who already produce arms and try to lure them over to produce arms in my own state, right? So that creates trade, and that creates the movement and diffusion of knowledge within the international state system as far as arms production is concerned. Krauss also says that as we look at the changes in the structure of arms transfer and production, we should also see a mirror of the changes in the international system as a whole. Because what's required to make arms is also the very thing that we tend to measure a hierarchy of state power, your wealth, in your pursuit of power, your ability to make arms, your ability to have an army, and so on. So as it changes, we should also see that those changes in the structure of the arms transfer and production system mirrored in the international system as a whole. We should see the same type of hierarchy within both. Krauss also points out that trade in arms, and this is something that is incredibly important even today, when we're talking about the arms trade, we aren't just talking about a physical transaction of goods. we're also talking about intangible things too. In one of the weeks, I believe it's week 5. I'll have to check. What I really wanted to do this year is try to get a little bit away from theory, because I feel like if we're too far nested in theory, people that haven't had an in-depth background in international relations theory are a going to find it boring as hell and tune out, and b they're not really going to understand what I'm trying to say. So what I wanted to do this year, and what I am going to do this year, is kind of back off a tad bit on that theory to really try to get the message to you home, and also give you some insight into practically how these things are actually transferred. So I believe in one of the weeks I actually walk you through what I usually do each and every day at my job for the past, 2 years here, currently at Defense Trade Solutions, and then prior for the 4 years at Raytheon. I'm going to teach you how the U.S. transfers arms. Okay, because that practical understanding I find more valuable. But anyway, besides that, let's go to the next pursuit that Krauss talks about, and that's going to be the pursuit of victory. What Krauss says about the pursuit of victory is that the pursuit of victory provides a stimulus to arms transfers, arms production, and military innovation. If you want to win, if you want to pursue victory in the international state system in conflict, you're always going to be one step ahead or have the best arms, or try to invest to the point where you make a new piece of weaponry which is going to give you more power because you're looking to win in battle. Krauss also says that the optimum scale of the nation state is partly determined by its ability to mobilize for war. In other words, the international hierarchy should reflect the hierarchy in the arms trade and production system. It's talking about the scale of the nation state. How much money do you have? How big is your military? How many arms can you produce, and so on? Right? The optimum scale of the nation state is partly determined by its ability to mobilize for war. It has to have the inputs to mobilize for war. There's a reason why your larger states like the US, like China, like Russia are the main states producing state-of-the-art weapons. It's because they have the scale, the money, the infrastructure, the knowledge base to produce these things. So now that we understand that the 3 different pursuits lead to change within the international state system and the arms production and trade system, how exactly does change occur? And Krauss says that change occurs through two primary means. One, innovation, which is usually incremental and slow, and then technological diffusion. And with those two results in systemic change. When those tend to come together, they're going to create a massive change in the international state system and the system of arms production and trade. Technological diffusion is interesting, though. Technological diffusion is helped through arms transfers, but also through the transfer of knowledge. So going back to that concept of, often when we think of arms transfers, we think of these transfer of tangible goods. We're also talking about knowledge here. Technological diffusion tends to occur far more readily when the knowledge on how to produce the arms is diffused, not just the arms themselves. So Krauss says when those two things come together, you tend to have this massive change in the arms trade and production system. And we can look back towards social theory and the concept of a punctuated equilibrium to help us kind of understand these massive sea changes within technology. Punctuated equilibrium, if you aren't familiar with it, it essentially means that social systems tend to exist in an extended period of stasis, which may be punctuated by sudden shifts leading to radical change. People usually are adverse to change, so the system over time usually changes incrementally, very slowly, until you reach some inflection point in which all of a sudden everything just begins to change. You almost have like a cascade effect. Now, since the arms trade and production system is inherently a social system we should be able to find instances of events or revolutions that change the structure. And luckily for Krauss, or luckily for us, Krauss did the legwork on this and said, you know, military historians have already found that there's technological revolutions which have affected the type of weaponry over time. And Krauss said, well, those may be these revolutions which changed the system itself. And sure enough, he was right. What were the revolutions which he talked about? Well, there's four of them. It's going to be the Gunpowder Revolution, which is going to run roughly from 1400 to 1800. Remember, these are rough estimates. There's somewhat of a blur of the line of when things actually change. Then two, the Industrial Revolution from 1800 to 1930. Then we have the short-lived Mobility Revolution from 1930 to 1945. Then lastly, and arguably is still the one in which we're living in now, which is the Nuclear Revolution. Each one of these revolutions saw a sea change in the type of arms production and trade, as well as the technological innovation for arms at those points in time. Now, within each one of the military revolutions, I want you to understand A, who the primary producers were, B, the patterns of trade, and see how diffusion took place. Remember, we're examining these things from a systems level. If you understand who's the primary makers of these arms, and you understand how they're beginning to trade and what they're going to trade, and how diffusion took place, you can begin to understand exactly the change in the arms production and trade system as far as the hierarchy is concerned. So let's go ahead and dive into the first one that Krauss talks about, which is going to be the Gunpowder Revolution. Now, the Gunpowder Revolution began roughly around 1400. And one thing to keep in mind this entire time is that gunpowder and cannon were especially expensive at this point in time. Gunpowder and cannon had existed prior to this time period, yes, but A, the large-scale production of cannon was not around really prior to this period because the technology wasn't quite there yet. It was originally just a bunch of rods kind of welded together. It wasn't until we get to 1400 and onward where we saw these mass production of these solid metallic cannon which could take the pressure of firing these large munitions. But it was incredibly expensive to make these. The other problem with the transition between, like, let's look at the old style of war. You had swords, you had arrows, pikes, and all that. Well, think about who you usually recruited to use these arms. It was the serfs who were on your land. So the nobility would traditionally mobilize the serfs which worked on their lands, and they would give them swords and pikes and things like that. Your professional military was usually only your nobility because they had the time to train. They didn't necessarily have to worry about going out to the field. The problem when you go to cannon is that you just can't pull some dude off the field and teach them how to shoot a cannon. That's how you end up with an explosion, right? You have to train. The problem with that is if you have to train and you have to get somebody to specialize in it, and you're trying to field these massive amounts of cannon, right? So you need to train a massive amount. You need to create a group that you can draw from during times of conflict who are already trained. So then you begin to see this need for trained troops to man these cannon. Well, the problem is if I need to train these troops, I need to have money to train them. So not only do I need money to buy and make cannon because it's expensive, but I also need money to train these serfs into how to use these cannon. So where exactly do I get the cash? Well, France was the first state that really learned how to do this. Said, okay, I need cash. How do I get it? Well, I can get it from taxing. But if I tax everybody, then I need to hire enough tax collectors, and I need to make sure all the money comes to my palace, right? Which means that I'm going to create a bureaucracy. I'm going to create an army of tax collectors to fund the building of my army, right? There's not only a creation of kind of this proto-state bureaucracy, there's also the centralization of power. As we look at the Gunpowder Revolution and what really kind of led up to the use of cannon, the large-scale production of cannon, we have to understand what was going on in that particular time period. At the time period, in the early 1400s, we have to remember that this is on the tail end of the Hundred Years' War. And remember, the term state is a relatively loose term at this point in time. Most of these are small principalities and things like that. You really don't have this concept of the state. And France was really the one to kind of create this proto version of a state which would fly under one flag. One thing to keep in mind is at this point in time, even if you were a French king, if you wanted to form an army to go fight the British, what you usually did is you looked at your landed gentry or your nobility at that point in time, and you basically paid them to create an army that they would then bring to you and have you fight with, right? But the problem with that also is most of these small armies that would come together to engage in conflict for the monarch at the time, these smaller armies would usually fly under the flag of the nobility. So if you were a serf, you would usually fly the flag of whoever was paying you or allowing you to live and farm their land. You weren't flying the flag of the French king, right? But when you create a professional army, when you start to create these trained groups that are primarily made to protect the state and the actual king, they begin to fly under one flag, which is really important symbolically. It's this concept of now we're a state. I'm not fighting for the nobility, I'm fighting for the state. So let's step back just a second. I feel you like a win on a tangent. So at the tail end of the Hundred Years' War, there were a lot of mercenary armies who were essentially out of work. During the Hundred Years' War, both sides, both the British and the French, tended to hire mercenaries to kind of fill out some of their ranks, right? Well, the problem with that is that if you don't have a war, you have a bunch of trained soldiers with nothing to do with. And for any of you that have been around the military or in it, the worst thing that you could do for troops is to make them bored and give them nothing to do. So at this point in time, there were bands of mercenaries going around France that were extorting, pillaging, and kidnapping people all around the nation. So in 1439, France began to get tired of these issues with the mercenaries, so they restricted military training and recruitment to the king alone. No longer could somebody create a mercenary army. Essentially, what this did is it outlawed the use of force outside of the state. Okay? These mercenary armies were technically by law now not allowed to exist because remember, military training and recruitment were for the king and the king only. So if you were a mercenary band and you were trying to fill out your ranks and you trained somebody without the permission of the king, you now had issues. On top of that, there was a new tax called the taille, which paid for a new French army. And this got passed at the same time that the French legislature passed the restriction of military training for the king alone. Now think about what this essentially does. This makes all mercenaries outlaws, and what they were basically given is a choice of either you stay a mercenary and you die, or you join my newly formed army. Most of them, needless to say, joined up. So within a short period of time, France, under the king at that point in time, created the first standing professional army of 6,000 men. Now enough about a standing army, let's get back to cannon and gunpowder for just a second. So Charles VII is on the throne of France at this point in time, and he has the taille. And the taille changed the entire game. Prior to the Tale, cannon were fielded by multiple countries at that point in time, and even in the Hundred Years' War, Britain and France both used cannon, but not on a large scale. And the reason for that is let's go back and think about how the recruitment for militaries was done for conflict. Again, a monarch looked at the nobility to basically give him an army to field on the battlefield, right? Well, if you're relying on the nobility for that force, if you're a nobleman, the chances that you're going to go out and spend a ton of money on one cannon is probably going to be pretty low. So yes, cannon were used in the Hundred Years' War, but they weren't that many of them available and fielded at that point in time because they were expensive. But the Tally changed the entire game. It paid for troops, so it allowed Charles VII to have an army, but it also paid for the cannon, which allowed him to extend the military power of the army. This is the first army in the world which regularly fielded cannon, which at that point in time is the biggest, most powerful piece of military equipment that you could possibly have. It was the F-22 of its day, right? Not only was it expensive, but it was the most scary piece of military equipment that you could ever field. And now Charles VII had the money to produce a massive amount of them. And not only did he have the money to produce a massive amount, he had money to then train a standing army to use them, which created de facto one of the most powerful militaries that Europe had ever seen. But let's go back to cannon and the state just real quick. The Tally was a big taxation network. So it allowed him to collect all of this money. And to collect all the money, you had to have the bureaucracy in place to collect that money. So not only is the Tally creating this army under one French flag, centralizing power, the creation of bureaucracy and bringing all the money off of the Tally back to the king centralized more power. You're seeing the formation of a proto-state. This is the first time that states are really being constructed. Essentially, what you could say is that file cabinets tend to follow the firearms, because if you need the money, then you're going to have to collect it, and you have to create a bureaucracy to record and know how much to collect. All right, let's fast forward to Charles VIII. So Charles VIII comes to the throne, and he has this expanded army and incredible arsenal of cannon, more than any other power within Europe. What did he naturally do with it? He took over as much as he possibly could. So the invasion of Italy in 1494 was the first major conflict and major military expedition which fielded cannon. And he made short work of basically the entire country. His army was fielded, so then when they would come against the enemy, it was the first time that you had massive rows of cannon. Which, remember, at that point in time, hardly anybody else had that amount of power and that military equipment to field on the battlefield. So if you're a lowly Italian principality, you've basically looked at your nobility and tried to mobilize as many serfs off of their land as you could. Chances are, if you did have cannon, it was just going to be a few. And now you're looking at the first standing military of over 6,000, lined with cannon. That is a military power that you had never seen before, and needless to say, most of the principalities, as Charles VIII went through Italy, gave up. They didn't even fight. He steamrolled the entire country. Why? Because he had cannon, and nobody else did. And not only did he have cannon, he had a military that was trained to effectively use it in battle. What effect did that have? The jack-stomping of Italy by Charles VIII scared the hell out of basically all of Europe. So many monarchies and larger powers at that time looked at France and said, they just jack-stomped Italy in like 1 year. I'm going to need to do something or I'm going to be next. So other states within Europe began to create states in the same way that France did. They began to centralize power. They began to create an army. They began to tax the populace, and then they began to buy and manufacture cannon. And the motivation for this diffusion was fear. Ferdinand and Isabella, that are down there at the right in Spain, essentially in a short amount of time created similar institutions for taxation, just like France had to do the exact same thing that France had done, to not only field cannon, but also to field a military at the same time to use those. And Britain was doing the same thing at this point in time. So let's go ahead and take the 30,000 foot level, the systemic view of this particular point in time, to identify the systemic variables that we really want to look at. So during the Gunpowder Revolution era, we're looking at two different periods of production, and that would change over time. So Krauss points out that early during this period, Italy was the primary producer of arms. They could make these smaller scale cannon within Italy itself, but as cannon production began to ramp up, as more states began to pursue cannon production and trade, Italy just couldn't keep up. And the reason for that isn't so much that Italy didn't have the ability to produce cannon, it just didn't have the ability to produce it at the rate that demand would necessitate them to produce them. Primarily because they just didn't have access to natural resources in the adequate amount to produce the amount of cannon which was demanded. They didn't have enough access to iron ore. They didn't have enough access to coal. These natural resources constrained their ability to actually compete and produce at a level of other states. So naturally, because there was this constraint to production, the primary producer changed. It shifted from Italy over to England, France, Germany, Sweden, and Spain. But the primary producers, if you read, well, not if, you should read Krauss's book, is still going to be England and France, and the Low Countries between France and Germany as well. What's really interesting about this point in time is that if we look at the patterns of arms trade, there really wasn't a whole lot of arms trade. Yes, there are some instances where countries would trade arms to bolster alliances, but the fact was is most states which had cannon just didn't trade those cannon. And the reason for this is because there wasn't enough of a surplus to actually trade, at least during the early period of the Gunpowder Revolution. Making cannon was so time intensive and so labor intensive that no one state really had a surplus of arms. And think about the concept of trading arms. The only reason why you as a state would ever transfer or sell arms is if you had a surplus of arms to go and sell. If you don't have a surplus of arms, if you trade any of your arms, that's going to decrease the amount of power that your state has. So most states only had the ability to really produce enough cannon and gunpowder firearms at that point in time to basically arm themselves. And then you see kind of this increase of government control of the actual export of arms. So Elizabeth I was actually the first one to really put an arms embargo in place. She prohibited the export of cannon that was made in England to anywhere else but England. Now, the issue with that is as we go further into the Gunpowder Revolution, these states are becoming better and better at producing cannon, which increases the probability that you are going to have a surplus of arms. But instead of trading those arms out, because these kingdoms at this point in time saw any type of trade, unless it was some trade to bolster alliances, most of the time these monarchy and these states at this point in time saw any trade in arms as decreasing their own power. They didn't necessarily want to arm somebody else that could turn their arms against them, right? Like nobody wants to be shot with their own gun. So most states at this point in time really didn't like trade to begin with. Not only was there really not a surplus, especially during the early periods, even as we enter the late period of the Gunpowder Revolution, states just didn't like to transfer arms. But that created an issue. If you are in England and you are producing arms at such a rate to where the government has too much cannon and no longer wants to buy them, then you're naturally as a worker going to find somewhere else to find work. So if you can only produce arms for the state and the state goes, we have enough, I don't want to buy more, but your expertise is in building these arms, what are you naturally going to do? You're going to seek other opportunities, which goes directly into the method of diffusion and innovation at this period of time. Remember, because arms weren't really transferred out, there's not really a method of diffusion in the same way as there is now. Some of the diffusion which occurs now is just the fact that we transfer so many arms everywhere. So that creates a technological diffusion. But at this point in time, the tangible transfer of arms just wasn't really around. But what you did have is these masses of workers who knew how to produce these arms looking outwards and going, I mean, if you want to pay me, I'll make you cannon. So what you see is these migration of skilled workers. Sweden, Spain, these countries attracted these workers from places like England and France and went, I will pay you for you to come here as long as you set up a cannon production facility here and you train my own guys on how to make these things. So you saw the diffusion in the migration of skilled workers. Now, as far as innovation goes, unfortunately, during this period of time, because there was such a stifling within the arms trade, and states didn't really want to trade arms and trade technology, your pace of innovation was really, really slow. And that makes sense, especially when you look at the arms at that time. The cannon that were being used by Charles VII really didn't look much different than the cannon that Napoleon was using during the 1800s. The Brown Bess was fielded by the British from basically, was it, I think it's, Krauss said 1500 onward to the Revolutionary War. Your military technologies just didn't really change a whole lot. So there wasn't a whole lot of innovation over this period of time. It was just very slow. But as we move into the next period, what happens? You have steam and steel revolutionize the way that we produce arms and the way that we conduct warfare. And that led to the next revolution. From the gunpowder revolution, we move into the industrial revolution, which is also known as the steam and steel revolution, which ran roughly from 1800 to 1930. Now, the key characteristics of this particular revolution are pretty stark compared to the last one. Remember that most of the 17th century and 18th century arms trade and arms production and innovation was relatively quiet. There wasn't a whole lot of progression or innovation in the type of arms or the production of arms. The Industrial Revolution turned all of that on its head. Manufacturing sped up drastically. Techniques in metalworking, like the puddling process and things like that, led to larger, more powerful guns. So not only were you producing more cannon, you were producing more powerful, incredibly, like exponentially more powerful arms at this point in time. Innovation also sped up. It was much faster than the last period of time. You switched from muzzle loading to breech loading, from sails to propellers. Everything massively changed in a very short period of time. So naturally, this change in production was going to affect the arms production and trade system itself. And what we see during this particular point in time was the rise of the private producer. Previously, yes, you had private producers in the gunpowder revolution, but their production was very much dictated by the state. The state could tell it to stop producing. The fact that the Elizabeth I put the first arms embargo down, saying, if you produce, you can't sell outside of my state. Everything kind of changed within this era. You saw the rise of these large private producers. So you had companies like Krupp or companies like Vickers and Armstrong, which didn't just make cannon, they made ships, they made planes, they made these capital defense goods, they made everything. So even your private producer changed. Your private producers now could manufacture the whole gamut of military goods, not just one thing. But as these private producers began to come up and becoming so powerful, the fact that you had Krupp and Vickers and Armstrong producing everything, so Vickers and Armstrong basically armed the entire British nation with everything. What that also gave these private firms was power in the political arena. Vickers and Armstrong turned towards the British government and said, you have to ease up arms transfer restrictions because I need some way to make money. Because the more money I make, the better stuff I can make you. And governments at this point in time really began to kind of step off and not be involved in the arms production. They would kind of lightly say, like, please don't transfer arms to somebody that we really hate. Right? But ultimately, these decisions were primarily down to the private producer at this point in time. So if Krupp wanted to contract cannon out to Russia, there wasn't a whole lot that the German government could do to stop it. Same with Vickers and Armstrong and these larger arms production and arms producing firms. But this is the first time that you really see this need to export to survive. They needed to be able, because remember, now they're producing at such a rate where there's a massive amount of military surplus of arms. And if you aren't selling these arms, then you aren't making money. And it's within the state's best interest to keep these private producers alive, right? Because if your largest arms producer within your country, let's take Britain for example, and Vickers and Armstrong. If Vickers and Armstrong was to go under, the British government didn't have really anybody else to buy arms from, right? They wanted to be able to foster this indigenous production capability. So it was only natural for states to go, okay, you can sell as much as you want, as long as you make sure that we get the newest and the best stuff, which is really what these companies always did. Was in Germany, the Germans always got the newest Krupp guns. They always got the largest Krupp guns. And in Britain, if a new battleship came out, they would make sure to get the best and the newest one. So from the government perspective, they really didn't see an issue with allowing these private firms to export out all of these arms. They saw it as benefiting them. The more that Vickers and Armstrong and Krupp could export, the more that those countries in which those private firms were based could reap the rewards, not only financially, because now you have an employer within your nation which is employing a hell of a lot of people, but you're also reaping the funding and the capital rewards and the money that is coming from those sales. Okay. One other need, the other big reason why these firms needed to export out was also because steel guns were expensive to produce and research and development costs had to be spread. Governments continue to not invest a whole lot within their own arms production, so it was difficult. If Vickers wanted to keep and Krupp wanted to keep on the cutting edge and stay competitive, keep being a product that other nations actually wanted to buy, they had to invest into new stuff. They had to invest into research and development for the newest best thing. And if your government isn't willing to fund that, then the only way for you to finance the research and development is to sell and to keep selling. So these firms needed to sell, and governments at this point in time really didn't see a huge issue with it. But that doesn't mean the governments were not wary of arms exports. They were. They were still wary about the fact that all of these arms were being transferred all over the world. But to most of them, they thought, well, I mean, the fact is, though, is if a company needs to export out arms for the money to keep employment and keep the production lines open and running and keeping innovation occurring, then this was just a cost that they were going to have to bear. So governments didn't necessarily like the fact that these private arms were exporting out arms, as we saw in some of the examples that Krause gives, where Krupp was exporting cannon out to almost everybody at that point in time, and sometimes the German government stepped in and said, hey, please don't send it to them. Right, so governments were wary of the transfers and were wary of arms exports, but in their view, the benefits outweighed the consequences. Reliance on exports was essentially passively accepted by the state because of the advantage that it presented domestic procurement. Remember, too, the really nice thing about, and this is still why, even in the US, why your Raytheons and your Boeings want to export out as much as it can, why the F 35 was one of the first super technologically advanced primary defense goods which had export in mind, which had export customers in mind, was because the more you exported out, not only did you make more money, but it also lowered the unit costs of the weapons for the domestic country, right? The reason why we wanted everybody to buy the F 35 isn't necessarily because it's a great plane. It's because the more that the company in the US could sell those planes, the less per plane the US government would actually have to domestically procure it for. So it brings those unit costs down. Reliance on exports and the money coming back in also maintains the domestic producer's ability to keep producing cutting edge arms. So the domestic country reaps those rewards. So although the Krupp was exporting out cannon like crazy, the fact is that the German government always had access to the most state-of-the-art best cannon available because of the amount of money that Krupp was able to pour back into research and development. The same still happens today. Governments also like the fact that these larger arms companies like Krupp, like Vickers and Armstrong and so on, they employed a hell of a lot of people, which is really, really nice. So the government doesn't necessarily have to spend as much on welfare opportunities. Also, the money. The fact is that these companies were also being taxed, right? So the more money that they made, the more taxes the government could get out of the company that is domestically producing. And really importantly, too, is the government doesn't have to subsidize the arms company. So if research and development, if these producers weren't allowed to export out to make money to pour back into research and development, it was going to have to be the government that's going to have to bear the cost of the research and development in order to maintain the best military arms that they could possibly get. So exports allow governments to not have to subsidize the arms producers. In Britain, there was even a push by politicians to encourage exports by private firms to push innovation and competition to preserve capacity. So the one really nice thing about constantly having your Vickers and Armstrong or your Krupp running on high, running on tilt, is that if you ever went to war, those means of production you own. So if Vickers is making everything at such a high rate, it means that if you had to go into war, you could turn Vickers to produce everything just for your nation, which is a massive amount of military goods. The government finds value in that. It's also a reason why here in the U.S., especially with our primary capital defense goods like our M1A Abrams tanks and so on, we usually have those on low rate production at all times because we want to keep the production lines warm, because that's a national security issue. You want to ensure that these production lines can produce at a capacity that your nation is going to need if you do go into conflict. But there was a problem here. Procurement was high, and states would find themselves outgunned by other states. So Krauss points out some really funny instances in which Krupp was exporting out cannon that were far larger than the German government actually had. Innovation was occurring at such a rate where the domestic government just couldn't afford to keep spending on the newest stuff, right? Because it was coming every year, there was something bigger and more powerful, and government just couldn't afford to keep doing that. So there was partially an issue with that, right? Where Vickers and Armstrong produces battleships for Peru, which are more powerful than the battleships that Britain itself has, right? Like there were some issues with that. But the interesting thing about this period of time, and kind of the scary part that we'll go into a tad bit, is that it was really a free for all at this point in time, except for primarily France. France still kept strong control of production and the export of arms, which also explains why French domestic production tended to lag, especially going into World War II. Most of the French firms were largely nationalized. The government wanted to keep full control. This rise of the private producer, which happened in Germany and happened in Britain, it wasn't allowed to happen in France, which could also explain the declining French power at that point in time. So let's go ahead and zoom out for just a second. So, who were the primary producers at this time? Your first tier producers were going to be Britain, Germany, and France, which are these massive countries which could actively take advantage of all these new attributes that the Industrial Revolution gave them. They had the ability to build factories. They had the knowledge, the populace which had the knowledge to be able to produce these state of the art goods. They had these natural attributes. And so naturally they became first tier producers of arms. Your second tiers were Russia, Italy, and Japan. These countries, yes, could produce, but never really innovated on their own. They could produce primarily replication of arms produced somewhere else, although at times they did produce their own domestically and indigenously designed things. And then third tier, Krauss identifies as Turkey and China, who, yes, had the capacity to produce some arms, but primarily they were reproduction and they still relied largely on the import of arms. Now, what was the pattern of trade during this point in time? Krauss points out that most of the arms being traded now were based on alliance ties, co-production, and licensing. So if states did transfer arms, if the governments did actually sell arms, they were usually done to bolster alliances. What was also going on during this point in time was this large co-production and licensing push, right? So prior to that, you would have during the gunpowder revolution, right? You would have the migration of skilled workers would kind of spread out this knowledge. So if I was Spain, I would hire a person who was knowledgeable in cannon making from Britain to come down and help train my guys on how to make cannon. This period of time, you could literally go to Krupp and go, I want you to build an entire factory within my nation to build this type of cannon, and they would do it, right? So you had these larger pushes of like this wholesale shift of co-production and manufacturing into a nation which didn't have the capacity before. So I could be a state like Turkey who had no domestic production capacity, and if I could pay Krupp enough, he would set up an entire factory to make arms within my country. So this is the primary pattern of trade going on here. States weren't necessarily buying too many arms, right? But they were just buying the ability to make arms at this point in time. What really caused innovation and diffusion was this need to compete with private industry exports, right? So Krupp needed to compete with the Vickers and Armstrong and so on. These larger private companies were trying to compete with each other. So the only way that they could compete with each other was always trying to find a leg up, something technologically new over and over and over again. So this was really pushing this pattern of innovation and this diffusion of knowledge that would eventually result in this very short period of the mobility revolution of the 30s and in 1945, and then eventually into the nuclear revolution. Now, the reason why I'm not going to go over the mobility revolution and the nuclear revolution is kind of twofold. First, for the mobility revolution, yes, your primary producers do change a tad bit because the U.S. comes into play here. But as far as the patterns of trade, you see more trade in arms, but it's not incredibly different from the Industrial Revolution side. And it was so short lasting that I don't necessarily know that it's going to behoove us to really spend time on that. The reason why I'm not going over the nuclear revolution is essentially next week when you read Lawrence's book on the evolution of the arms trade. It looks at the evolution of the arms trade system post-World War II. So you essentially get that entire era kind of at a micro level. And we will go over that next week, really looking at these these shifts from the post World War II era and looking at the 1945 to essentially now era, seeing how those 50 odd years represented a lot of different periods of change and kind of the shifting of how arms were traded, sold, and who was kind of who were the kind of big players within the arms production and trade system at that point in time. So that will do it for week one's lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the readings. Again, don't forget to post those discussion posts. And remember that the discussion post, you will answer my initial discussion question. You will pose your own question. You will answer one of your peers. So I look forward to engaging in those discussions with you. I hope you guys are thoroughly interested with the subject. I think that this, I always enjoy when I teach this each year. I think it's incredibly valuable, especially in this particular program for so many of you within the field to have the opportunity to better understand how arms production and transfer plays out now and has played out in the past. So I hope you guys are going to enjoy this course as much as I love to teach this. And just make sure that you get your discussion post done, and then email me or reach out to me if you have any questions at all, if you have any issues with the D2L course. I think it's pretty well set up now, but every year that I do this, there's always some dumb thing that I tend to miss. So if you guys do see something that's that there may be a link broken or something like that, feel free to reach out to me and I will get back to you guys as soon as possible. Thanks.